So for those of you not too familiar with the book, it's kind of hard to describe, and I think in a lot of ways it mirrors your own background in terms of a degree in religious studies, also working in terms of social justice, a law degree, your relationships with different cultures and ethnicities. It's very, I would say, boundary breaking in
Mm.
a lot of ways. Um, and we'll talk a little bit more about how. It's really hard not to give away too much about what goes on in the narrative because I don't want to spoil too much for you. But basically, it's in some ways a horror genre book, post-apocalyptic speculative fiction, a fantasy, there's a lot going on in there. But thinking about it, for those of you who don't know, the post-apocalypse has to deal with the big water. When climate change has brought about, you know, the melting of the polar ice caps and such, where millions and millions of people die because of the rising of the big water, followed by energy wars. And what becomes kind of interesting is the emergence of life forms that maybe, if I'm describing it well, maybe you could describe it yourself, of life forms that people hadn't thought about before that can become kind of threatening. So I want you to maybe tell us why speculative fiction? Since you're so
Mm.
talented as a nonfiction writer,
Oh,
and I know your background with your mother being an English teacher that you've read widely.
right.
So why this
Well,
genre?
I read widely in speculative fiction, so you know that's that's my place. Like that's where what I grew up with all my life. I think the first book I really remember like affecting me was Dune by Frank Herbert. I read David Eddings. Like I was a huge fantasy nerd, you know, and so science fiction, fantasy, all of that is just what I grew up reading. And so when it came time for me to write a novel, I knew that's what I wanted to write. That's the genre I wanted to be in.
Mhm. So one of the things that I appreciated thinking about it is that we learn a lot about Diné culture,
Mm.
and that what's one of the things I appreciate is that we're moved away from the European mythology into another culture.
Right, because I love all those books, but they're all about like white boys, you know, what usually white boys questing, white boys winning the day, you know, that sort of thing. And I wanted to write a book where the characters look like people I knew. They look like me or people that I was surrounded by and my family and all of that. But I wanted it to be in the speculative fiction genre.
Hmm.
And so, you know, I think at the time I was living in Navajo. I'm part of, my husband is Navajo. I'm Okewenge on my mother's side and African American on my father's side. And Okewenge is a tribe in New Mexico. And we are neighbors with the Dene, the Navajo. And my husband is Navajo, and I was living on the Navajo Nation at the time, working there in legal aid. And so these were the people that are around me. These are my family and friends. And of course, you know, the culture is so rich in stories and in traditions, and but also so real, like in people. So I wanted to bring a lot of that, like the stories and tradition and the sort of excitement of like Navajo culture to the page because I knew a lot of people did not know about that. They know about stereotypes, they know about feathers and braids and like that sort of thing. So I wanted to make it real too, like the people that I know, the people that drive old trucks, and you know the people that um, you know, go to visit, you know, their grandpa on the weekends, you know, that sort of thing.
Hmm.
So I wanted to balance the sort of the supernatural, for lack of a better term, and the very sort of grounded, realistic
Hmm. Hmm.
places I knew.
And a woman as protagonist.
Oh yeah, you know, and that took a little doing. You know, I think I always say the programming is real. Like it's sometimes really hard to write strong female characters if you've grown up reading male characters your whole life. And so I struggled a bit with that at first. Just like in the second book, Storm of Locusts, the one that comes after Trail of Lightning, it's all about female friendships. And the main character from Trail of Lightning has to really grow and she's not a real people person, so this is her chance to like meet people and make friends and stuff. And that was a struggle, you know, to sort of write that through because you don't see a lot of female friendships on the page.
Hmm.
Um, and so when I came to write her as well, you know, like I think Daniel said before me, so much of our writing is autobiographical, you know, like so much of it is pulled from the things that we know. So she's got a lot of me in her. And like you said, a lot of the sort of unique background that I have, I think is pulled into her struggles, at least metaphorically.
Hmm.
And So yeah, hopefully that turned out okay.
So see, now I can't wait till April.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, because female friendships, I think, are missing from a lot of pop culture. Because usually, if
Hmm.
there's more than one woman, they're not supporting each other; they're competing.
Right,
And
right.
so that'll be a nice change. So your book takes place in the sixth world. Can you tell us about what the previous five worlds were?
So in Navajo traditional stories, sometimes it's 4 and sometimes it's 5, depending on where you are, on the res and who you're talking to. But they believe that in an emergent story, so that humans came up or beings came up through other worlds, and so we are now in the 5th world, the glittering world. But that world will, I assume, eventually end, and you'll have a new world, just as the other worlds before it ended, and usually in something cataclysmic, like a flood. So when I was thinking about how, I wanted to write in the genre of urban fantasy, but I really like this idea of apocalypse, because I think for indigenous people, I always say that our apocalypse has already happened. We have already seen the end of our world, and all these sort of tropes that you see in dystopian stories where they take your kids and they send them to this rigorous school where they're ground down, and all these sort of things. That all happened. That's all real. We don't have to pretend. We don't have to make up a story to tell you how bad it can get. We know. And so I wanted to take those things and I wanted to sort of flip them. And I wanted to say that we know the apocalypse. So when the rest of the world has their apocalypse, we're going to be okay. This is like a new start. So, and also, if you spend any time, I'm sure there's some natives out there. If you live on the res or you spend any time, there, the people, they work hard. I mean, you gotta. When I lived with my in-laws, we did not have running water. We hauled our water in. We ran electricity off a generator. There were 7 of us in a pretty small trailer. So you're living hard, and you're working, and that's not an unusual condition. And I think most people don't know that. So, you go ahead and have your apocalypse and you freak out when you lose your electricity, and natives are going to be like, all right, it's just Tuesday, it's just another day. And I wanted to capture some of that too.
And you captured it well.
Yay, thank you.
So I wanted to go back to the character of Maggie because I thought it was interesting that Karen Kusama, the movie director, was talking about her new movie Destroyer. And she said she didn't give a shit if anybody didn't like her character. And if you go through the canon of literature, most of those men are not likable. But women are not allowed to be that way. And so can you talk more, because you talked about that struggle with the character of Maggie. Can you talk more about, so again, I don't want to give away too much about her personality and why you went that
she's
route.
Terrible.
Because as you mentioned with a lot of the traditional fantasy, with the quest, as you call the white boy quest, they're not as flawed or as difficult in terms of relationships as Maggie is. Can you talk a little bit about her?
Yeah, and I have gotten that. Some people, bless them, are like, I love her, she's great. But most people are like, we don't know. We don't want to be your friend. And I agree, you probably don't want to be your friend, but you want her at your back. You want her, or at least by your side. I think there are a lot, especially I think for women of color, a lot of things Maggie does, I think you're right. If it was a male protagonist, nobody would blink an eye. They'd think like, oh, he's such a badass, But when she does it, and in the story, as she goes through, because they're sort of on a kind of a quest, they're trying to solve a mystery of like who created this monster. She encounters all these men, and the majority of them react to her very poorly. Because she's very difficult. She's not what you would call like, the likable sort of female protagonist.
But for me, that made her likable.
Yeah, and I think hopefully, a lot of women, especially women of color, are gonna look at that and be like, I know that, that's familiar. So yeah, and I just wanted to keep her real to me. Like my most important thing with Maggie is she's dealing with a lot of baggage. Like there's a lot of shit that went down for her before the book starts. And so, it doesn't go away just because I'm telling a story. That is the thing that the character brings with her. And you're going to see her growth. There is a character arc, and it's bigger than just one book. It's a whole series, because when people come back to me and are like, what? She's still, she hasn't, she's not where I want her to be at the end. I'm like, she makes some bad decisions because she's human, So yeah, that was my most important point. I wanted her to be real.
Very nice. Okay, so one of the things I was thinking about with all the boundary crossing that you did is also thinking about the way the different, I hear these sort of narrow alleys of genre fall in there, but thinking about horror aspects.
Oh yeah.
Have people critiqued you for it being so raw and some of the violence that shows up?
Yes, so the book is it's sort of a mashup of urban fantasy, science. So it follows a lot of the tropes of urban fantasy. If you've read those should sound very familiar. Um, but it's also science fiction. It's apocalyptic, and it's definitely horror. There are some scenes that are very violent and dark. Uh, But I think for me, especially coming, from a Native perspective, so there's this whole missing and murdered Indigenous women, and I don't know if people know about that, but thousands of Indigenous women in the United States and Canada go missing every year and are often found murdered, and it never makes the news. It's like nothing. Like it's like we don't exist. Um, and so if the stat is something like 1 in 3 Native women will be a victim of violence in their lifetime. And so when you are coming from a world like that, your life is violence. Your life can be, very dark and like dangerous. And so I wanted to capture some of that too. I didn't want to gloss over the violence, and I have been critiqued for that. Some people think it's too much, and that is fair. And if it's not your cup of tea, I totally get it. For me, it was important to convey the horror of that kind of violence, I didn't want to gloss it over. I didn't want, pew pew, fake blood. I wanted you to feel some abhorrence. I wanted you to feel some, discomfort in the level of violence that she has to live
Yes,
through.
and I think because it's grounded, it's an interesting irony you have going on in that it's grounded in the real, while this other reality exists with it.
Right.
But that was important to keep it that way.
Yeah.
I think not only just because of the reality of violence, but also because horror is not entertaining. The things that happen are not entertaining. And
Right.
so we need to understand that and not get a pleasurable,
Right.
I think, response to
Right,
it.
right. Or gloss it over. I think it would be worse if you read the scenes. There's only like 1 or 2 violent scenes, but if you read those scenes and it didn't affect you, if you just turned the page and kept going, then I don't think I've done my job. If it makes you pause, and like I've had people put the book down, I understand. Hopefully they came back, but that's my job.
So thinking about the violence committed in the book, going back to thinking about the monsters. Well, we have our human monsters. We have those aspects of ourselves that we may find distasteful. But thinking about them as a kind of metaphor, and I'm just thinking about the description of the monsters. One of the things I won't talk too much about, but they're described as sort of the teeth, I thought was an interesting kind of metaphor. So that it talks about how these monsters, or at least the one that's described in the book, has even teeth that almost are like old wooden dentures with no incisors, yet they bite. So how did you come up with that idea?
Oh.
And sort of, what do you think?
I don't even know that I like that you interpreted that like really deeply, because I'm not sure that was that deep. But the story is about a monster hunter. The main character, Maggie, is a monster hunter. But I wanted the monsters to be both real in the story and metaphorical, because sometimes people are like, she only hunts like 2 monsters, and I'm like, she is hunting monsters the whole time. The whole story is her battling monsters, but some of them are internal, some of them are her own demons. But the physical monster that they find like lacks. I'm trying to think if that's a giveaway. I can't remember what all I've said. Well, maybe I won't tell you some details. I'll let you find out. But one of the things it does, it has the flat teeth. And honestly, I think what I was thinking about that, I was thinking of that line in Smoke Signals. Do y'all know Smoke Signals, the movie, where they sing John Wayne's teeth? And they're like, John. Well, I'm not gonna sing it because I can't sing. But they're talking about his dentures, his wooden dentures, and how they're like I just thought, oh, that straight line dentures. Like you think of like the The white man who snaps.
See, I'm
I
sitting
don't
here
know.
loving it because I'm thinking about the relationship, right? The colonialism and all that.
Yeah,
with the
there's a
John
little bit
Wayne
of
and
that,
things.
but you could, yeah, I'm for that.
Me too. But one of the things that was real interesting in the book, when the monster attacks one of the characters, because it doesn't have those sharp teeth, it's like gnawing and gnawing, and it's this horrible, elongated thing. Thinking about how someone had speculated that it was going for the vocal cords. And the fact that it's a little girl, and talking about the missing women and the not allowing women to have a voice.
Yeah, that's on purpose.
I love that.
Now I can feel deep. Yes, that I did on purpose.
Okay, let me see. Oh, yeah, I have tons of questions. So one of the things I thought was interesting about the book, and I appreciate the nonlinear structure, thinking about how the present exists in the book, right? Because we're reading it now. Thinking about the future, and then also the past. Is that a culturally based sort of sense of the way time works? I'm just gonna, put my ignorance about DNA culture out there. So I was just curious.
Yeah, you know, I think that felt natural to me. I'm not sure I really thought that through. I know that, I have argued in other works, in nonfiction works, that this sort of realm of indigenous futurism, which is sort of a child of Afrofuturism. The term was coined by Grace Dillon and at University of Portland. This idea of indigenous futurism, that there is a melding of the past and the present and the future. That there's not a real separation between time for indigenous cultures. That this is sort of a false thing that is not part of our cultures traditionally. So I might have tapped into some of that. Once again, I'm gonna say that sounds great, but I don't know that I did it on purpose. Yeah, it just felt natural.
And natural to thinking about the wall that shows up. I was curious about that, right? Where all this discussion has been going on the last few years.
So interesting. I read this book actually before Trump was elected. And I had originally put in a wall. So in the story, the apocalypse sort of has happened. The world has gone to hell in a handbasket, but the Navajo Nation, the Dene, are fine. They're doing pretty good, right? They're a little more prepared. But they've built a wall around the reservation, around the nation, to keep the riffraff out. And I had written it that way before Trump was elected, and then I took it out when I was querying it. But when I was talking to my editor about it, I was like, well, I did write this thing with a wall. And by then Trump had been elected and he was like, put the wall back in, put the wall in. So we added the wall back in. But for the Dene, the wall is sacred. It actually rises with the help of the holy people, which are sort of like the Dene gods, ancestors sort of thing. And the wall keeps them safe. The wall is made from sacred stones and shells. And
this is beautiful.
Yeah.
Book.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it's a play on the idea of the wall, right? So indigenous people building a wall to keep everyone else out, I thought was kind of badass. But that's the idea.
It's too bad they didn't.
Yeah, right? Notes to self.
Okay. The other thing I really appreciated about the book, besides the sort of the way you structured it, was it just feels so urgent. The language that you use, the way you structure your sentences, and the sort of length of the chapters, I found really interesting. And sort of, did you just write it with the mood and tone? It just came out?
So that's a craft sort of thing?
So did you have to go back and edit it because you thought it was too light, too dark?
So it is a craft decision. I wrote it in first person present because I wanted that sense of urgency. The sentences are mostly short sentences. It was funny, I went through copy edits, and the copy editor came back with all these semicolons, because I have all these like short, choppy sentences, and I was like, there are no semicolons in the apocalypse. Get those out. So so it was like, stat. Just keep it the way it is. I wanted it like that. I want it short and choppy and urgent. Yeah, thank you. I'm glad
the
that
intensity of it.
that
I
worked.
mean, there are moments when I'm reading it, I couldn't breathe.
Yeah.
Literally, I'm just like,
Yeah.
It really came across well. So I appreciate that, especially with given what goes on in the book. Why do you think people consider it a young adult novel?
Well, it is not a young adult novel. It is an adult novel. I think there is sort of a love triangle. And look, I love a love triangle, so don't even judge me if I put my love triangle. It's the best. But it doesn't work out quite the way you think it would work out. It's sort of a dark and twisted love triangle. I think that's one of the reasons. I think people see a love triangle and they think, oh, it's young adult. I think also women who write speculative fiction, particularly with female protagonists, the strong female protagonists, often get categorized as young adult. It's sort of a phenomenon. And to be fair, hopefully it hits a little bit of a sweet spot. I think I read a lot of young adult. I love young adult, but I also read a lot of adult too. So maybe it sort of hits that sweet spot with my style and the pacing and that sort of thing between young adult and adult.
So since we talked earlier about some of your craft issues, can you talk about the difference between writing short fiction versus novels? Do you have a preference, or they just each have their own uses?
Yeah, so I write short fiction too. That's what I won the awards for. I think with short fiction, I'm a much more loose. I have a emotion I'm looking for, or I have some sort of feeling I want to capture. Something that's shorter gives me the freedom to experiment a little bit more. When I write a novel, I'm pretty standard. I follow sort of a 3-act structure. I want to hit my plot points here. I'm a planner, not a pantser, as they say. And with a short story, I'm a little less so. I often start a short story, I don't know where I'm going. Whereas when I write a novel, I know where I want to end up. So yeah, I don't know. I don't think I have a preference. They're just very different. And sometimes it's fun to write short fiction because you can experiment with a lot of different things, and you're not as committed. It doesn't take clearly as long to write that.
And how long did it take to write Trails of Lightning?
So I started writing. So I'm a lawyer by day, unfortunately, but no, it's good. I studied federal Indian law and tribal law in law school, and that's how I ended up working on the Navajo Nation. But it was I find law fairly unfulfilling. So I started writing, and I had a baby who's now 11, who's over there with her headphones on. She ain't even listening to me.
Just like mine. She's
I know, right? She's like, whatever. I heard it a million times. So she was little though, and I just really didn't have anything for myself. And so I started writing, and I've always written sort of as a hobby. Speculative fiction. I have reams and reams of vampire stories. A lot of them have love triangles. Do not judge me. But no, nobody sparkles. But
thank you.
I know, right? So I started writing Trail of Lightning, I guess probably in like 2013 or something, and I was writing it for myself. That was after I put the baby to bed, sitting at the side of her bed late night typing, doing this thing that was keeping me sane. And then I joined a writing group, I guess like in, oh gosh, I can't remember, maybe like 2015 or so. And they were all published writers, and I was not. And they said, well, you can join our group anyway. They probably weren't expecting much, but they were like, it turned out to be pretty good. And they really encouraged me. They were like, hey, you should maybe try to get this published. And I was like, really? Yeah. So I did. That's my story. Yeah. But so it took me probably 2 years to write it and another year to edit it. And then, yeah.
So, I noticed that you talked about the writers group a little bit in your acknowledgments. So now that it's published and you're working on the rest of the series and also your other work, you still meet with a group? Is the process different? Do you have to keep it secret and only you and your editor at the publisher?
So there are some books that I am writing right now that y'all don't know about, that I'm not allowed to talk about. So those nobody knows about. You will know at some point, but those are under wraps. Other books like the epic fantasy you mentioned, Between Earth and Sky, I do have a writing group. Now I leveled up, and there's actually a lot of science fiction and fantasy writers in New Mexico. You probably know some of their famous names, which I won't mention, but they're in my writing group. So now I have those dudes reading my stuff and giving me feedback. So that's pretty nice. Yeah. So I still belong to a writing group. Absolutely.
Okay, that's always good advice. So I'm gonna try and transition over to some other things. Any advice for the aspiring writers?
Oh yeah. Well, write what you want to write. I think if I had thought so I really came into writing, I'll be honest, with a real high level of like naivete. Like I didn't know I wasn't supposed to write what I wrote. I didn't know that I wasn't supposed to write these like sort of strong female characters that give everybody shit. I didn't know that it would be wild, or like really that groundbreaking to write something with so there's no white people in my book, but there's one white guy and he is dead. But but there are black folks, and there's obviously Navajo folks, and when I sort of set out to write that, I didn't consciously really think, okay, no white people in my book, because I think if I had known, or if I talked to somebody about that, they would have said, oh, that's never going to sell. Oh, you're never going to be able to like get away with that. You got to have at least one or two white people for all the white folks to identify with, right? Because what else are they get? But it is not true. You write what you want to write, like, and let the market. And I'm genre. I'm all over the board, kind of in genre. Like some people call it fantasy, some people call it science fiction. Like you said, young adult. I didn't really worry about any of that. And you, as a writer, I don't think you have to write to the market. I think you can write what you want to write, and you let the market work it out.
Thank you.
That'd be my advice.
Okay. I asked if she would be kind enough because I love to hear people read their work. I love the oral traditions. So if you would read something for us.
Right. So since we're here to talk about my novel, I thought I would read you from my short story. Like, so I'm just going to read a little excerpt from actually the short story, Welcome to Your Authentic Indian Experience, trademark. And this is the story that I was blessed to win the Hugo and the Nebula for. It was also a Sturgeon, a World Fantasy, and a Locus finalist. Yeah, so I think it's pretty good, but we'll find out, right? You get to decide. Okay, so welcome to your authentic Indian experience, trademark. You maintain a menu of a half dozen experiences on your digital blackboard, but Vision Quest is the one the tourists choose the most. That certainly makes your workday easy. All a Vision Quest requires is a dash of mystical shaman, a spirit animal, wolf usually, but birds of prey are on the upswing this year, and the approximation of a peyote experience. Tourists always come out of the experience feeling spiritually transformed. You've never actually tried peyote, but you did smoke your share of weed during that 1 year at Arizona State, and who's going to call you on the difference? It's all 101 stuff, really, these quests. But no other Indian working at Sedona Sweats can do it better. Your sales numbers are tops. Your wife, Teresa, doesn't approve of the gig. Oh, she likes you working, especially after that dismal stretch of unemployment the year before last, when she almost left you. But she thinks the job itself is demeaning. Our last name's not Trueblood, she complains when you tell her about your nom de rêve. Nobody wants to buy a Vision Quest from a Jesse Turnblatt, you explain. I need to sound more Indian. You are Indian, she says. Turnblatt's Indian sounding enough because you're already Indian. We're not the right kind of Indian, you counter. I mean, we're Catholic, for Christ's sake. What Teresa doesn't understand is that tourists don't want a real Indian experience. They want what they can see in the movies. And who can blame them? Movie Indians are terrific. So you watch the same movies the tourists do, until John Dunbar becomes your spirit animal and stands with Fist, your best girl. You memorize Johnny Depp's lines from The Lone Ranger and hang a picture of Iron Eyes Cody in your work locker. For a while, you're really into Dustin Hoffman's Little Big Man. It's Little Big Man that does you in. For a week in June, you convince your boss to offer a Custer's Last Stand special, thinking there might be a tourist or two who want to live out a crazy horse experience. You even memorize some quotes attributed to the Venerable Sioux chief that you find on the internet. You plan to make it real authentic. But you don't get a single taker. Your numbers nosedive. Management in Phoenix notices, and boss drops it from the blackboard by 4th of July weekend. He yells at you to stop screwing around, accuses you of trying to be an artiste or whatnot. Tourists don't come to Sedona Sweats to live out a goddamn battle, boss says in the break room over lunch one day, especially if the white guy loses. They come here to find themselves. Boss waves his hand in the air in approximation of something vaguely prayer-like. It's a spiritual experience we're offering. Top quality. The fucking best. Daran, your Navajo coworker with the pretty smile and the perfect teeth, snorts loudly. She takes a bite of her sandwich, mutton by the looks of it. Her jaw works, her sharp teeth flash white. She waits until she's finished chewing to say, "Nothing spiritual about squaw fantasy." Squaw fantasy is boss's latest idea, his way to get the numbers up and impress management. Daran and a few others have complained about the use of the ugly slur. The inclusion of a sexual fantasy is an experience at all. But boss is unmoved, especially when the first week's numbers roll in. Biggest seller yet. Boss looks over at you. What do you think? Boss is Pima, with a bushy mustache and a thick head of still dark hair. You admire that about him, virility. Boss makes being a man look easy, makes everything look easy, real, authentic-like. Daran tilts her head, long beaded earrings swinging, and waits. Her painted nails click impatiently against the Formica lunch table. You can smell the onion in her sandwich. Your mouth is dry like the red rock desert you can see outside your window. If you say squaw fantasy is demeaning, boss will mock you, call you a pussy or worse. If you think it's okay, Daran and her crew will put you on the guys who are assholes list, and you'll deserve it. You sip your bottled water, stalling. Decide that in the wake of the Crazy Horse debacle, that boss's approval means more than Daran's, and venture, if the tourists like it. Boss slaps the table, triumphant. Daran's face twists in disgust. What does Teresa think of that? Jesse, she spits at you. You tell her boss is thinking of adding Savage Braves to the menu next. He's going to have you in a loincloth and hair down to your ass. See how you like it. Your face heaps up, embarrassed. You push away from the table, too quickly, and the flimsy top teeters. You can hear boss's shouts of protest as his vending machine lemonade tilts dangerously, and Daran's mocking laugh, but it all comes to your ears through a shroud of thick cotton. You mumble something about getting back to work. The sound of arguing trails you down the hall.
Thank you.
We'll stop there.